Welcome back to the deep dive. When most people, certainly outside Japan, hear the word kamikaze, I think one image usually springs to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that image of the pilot, right? The World War II pilot.
Yeah.
Often framed as, fanatical, maybe desperate, a sort of symbol of absolute military devotion right at the end of the war.
Exactly. And it's a really powerful image, but it's also quite well simplified, isn't it? It kind of rips the whole thing out of context.
It really does. It makes it seem like this sudden, almost irrational explosion of fanaticism, rather than something with deep, deep historical roots.
And that's exactly what we want to dig into today. We're aiming to challenge that snapshot view. We've gathered sources that trace this idea, this path to kamikaze, not just over the war years, but over nearly 900 years.
It's a long view. We want to show how this progression towards, well, state-sanctioned purpose-built suicide attacks wasn't sudden at all. It was actually, within Japan's specific context, quite gradual, maybe even logical in a historical sense.
A culmination of centuries of unique political shifts, cultural norms, and ideological conditioning.
Right. So we're starting way back. Think 13th century, the Mongol invasions.
Okay.
Then we'll move through the long piece of the Edo period, that isolation, follow the thread through the shock of Western contact, World War II, obviously, and even into the American occupation after the war.
So the core question we're exploring, for you listening, is how does a culture where heroic self-sacrificial death is revered, how does that become deliberately engineered into military doctrine over such a long time? And maybe just as importantly, what happens when that doctrine finally hits the wall of absolute defeat?
It's quite a journey.
It really is. So let's start where the name itself comes from, kamikaze.
What?
Divine wind. We need to go back to the 13th century. Mongols.
That's the spot. Okay, so picture Japan in the mid-13th century, pretty much isolated, an island nation, and suddenly they're facing this colossal threat from the mainland, Kublai Khan.
The Mongol emperor running the Yuan dynasty in China. He'd conquered, well, almost everything else, hadn't he?
Pretty much. And starting around 1260 out, he starts demanding tribute from Japan, sends envoys, letters, basically said, pay up or else. Japan. They gave him what the sources call diplomatic silence.
Just ignored him. Risky move.
Very. But why was Kublai Khan so interested? Well, our sources point to a couple of things. First, there was this persistent myth, almost legendary status, of Japan as the island of gold.
Right, Marco Polo wrote about that too, didn't he? The idea that it was just overflowing with precious metals.
Exactly, that was a big lore.
Yeah.
But there was also a practical military reason. Japanese pirates. These Waco pirates were a real thorn in the side of the Mongols and Chinese.
Harassing shipping lanes, disrupting trade.
A constant nuisance for the new Yuan dynasty. So wiping them out or bringing Japan under control served a strategic purpose too.
So Japan ignores the threats, doesn't send tribute, and the invasion comes. 1274.
And the scale is just mind-boggling for the time. Kublai Khan puts together this massive fleet, something like 800 ships, carrying maybe up to 40,000 troops, Mongols, Koreans, Chinese soldiers. Highly experienced forces.
And what did Japan have to counter that?
Not much. Maybe 4,000 to 6,000 men, mostly local samurai from Kyushu, where the Mongols landed. But the real problem wasn't just the numbers. It was the sheer imbalance in technology and tactics.
It was feudal warriors versus a coordinated modern army for the time.
Absolutely. The samurai were used to, more individualized combat, announcing their lineage before a duel, that sort of thing. The Mongols, they were disciplined, coordinated.
And they had weapons the Japanese hadn't really encountered.
Right. The sources mention things like armor-piercing crossbows, which were devastating, and crucially, gunpowder weapons. Early forms of catapults launching explosive grenades.
Wow. So not just arrows and swords.
Not at all. Plus, their tactics were overwhelming. Massive cavalry charges, disciplined infantry formations, phalanx tactics. The Japanese defensive just couldn't hold up against that kind of coordinated assault. They were getting pushback. It looked really bad.
They had established a beachhead at Hakata Bay. Things looked grim. And
then nature intervened. A massive storm, a typhoon, slams into the Mongol fleet anchored in the bay.
just obliterates them.
Destroys a huge chunk of the fleet. The Mongols, suddenly cut off, facing disaster, they were forced into this chaotic retreat. The Japanese couldn't believe their luck.
But it wasn't just luck, was it? Because it happened again.
Exactly. 7 years later, 1281, Kublai Khan, furious, tries again. This time, an even bigger invasion force. Some sources suggest over 4,000 ships, an absolutely enormous armada.
And
Another typhoon, just as massive, just as destructive, wipes out the second Mongol invasion fleet even more thoroughly than the first.
Incredible. And this is where the term kamikaze comes from.
Precisely.
Huh.
It wasn't seen as just a weather event, it was interpreted immediately as divine intervention. Kami, the gods, sending a kazi, a wind, a divine wind.
Protecting Japan.
Protecting Japan because it's the land of the gods, a special place with a special destiny. This idea, born from near annihilation and saved by apparent miracle, it lodged itself deep into the national consciousness. It became a foundational belief.
A belief that divine forces would intervene through sacrifice to protect the nation when human effort wasn't enough.
Got it. And that belief, that core idea, it kind of goes dormant, but it never disappears. It's there, ready to be called upon centuries later.
Which raises a really interesting point. How do you maintain that kind of warrior, self-sacrificial ideal when the nation then enters this incredibly long period of enforced peace and isolation?
Well, that's the great paradox, isn't it? And it takes us right into the next major era, the Tokugawa shogunate, the Edo period.
Right, the Edo period starts around 1600 with Tokugawa Ieyasu. This is all about locking things down after a century of pretty brutal civil war, stability, control.
Absolutely. The primary goal was peace, almost at any cost, and they achieved it. For about 250 years, Japan experienced this remarkable internal calm. A huge population, maybe 31 million people, living under this very rigid, centralized system, heavily influenced by Neo-Confucian ideas.
And Ieyasu was smart about how he maintained control, wasn't he? These mechanisms to stop local lords, the daimyos, from getting too powerful.
Oh, incredibly clever. The key system, the one everyone points to, is Senkin Chitai, alternate attendance.
Okay, break that down for us. What did it actually involve?
So basically, every daimyo, every feudal lord, had to maintain two big residences, one in their home domain and one in the capital, Edo, which is modern Tokyo.
And they had to travel back and forth?
Every other year, they had to live in Edo. But here's the really controlling part. Their families, their wives and heirs, had to live in Edo permanently.
Hostages. High-status hostages, but hostages nonetheless.
Pretty much. And think about the cost. Maintaining two massive households, plus the expense of traveling back and forth in a grand procession suitable for their rank.
Yeah.
It constantly drained the daimyo's finances.
So it kept them poor and kept their families under the shogun's eye, prevented them from building up power back home to challenge the central government.
Exactly. It was genius in a controlling sort of way. And this directly impacts the samurai class, the warrior elite. Suddenly there's no war. What do?
They become administrators, bureaucrats.
That's it. They shift from being warriors tied to the land to being essentially salaried administrators working for the daimyos or the shogunate. They lost the direct connection to land ownership.
And they weren't allowed to do other things, right? Like farming or business.
Strictly forbidden. Their status was purely based on their samurai rank, paid via stipends from their lord. But here's the paradox you mentioned earlier.
The ideological iron cage.
Right. Even though there's no fighting, the ideology, the Bushido code, loyalty, honor, self-sacrifice, it's meticulously maintained. It gets reinforced, even secularized, through Neo-Confucian philosophy, which becomes the dominant legal and ethical system for the ruling class.
So you have these samurai essentially doing paperwork, but still expected to live by this intense warrior code of self-sacrifice and honor.
It's a strange position. And this enforced peace creates another tension, an economic one. Neo-Confucianism officially looked down on commerce. Merchants were at the bottom of the social ladder.
But peace is good for business, right?
Incredibly good. So you see this explosion of commercial activity. The merchant class, the chonin, technically the lowest status, starts accumulating huge amounts of actual wealth. Real money.
While the samurai, with their fixed stipends, are struggling to keep up.
Exactly. Prices rise in this new commercial economy, but samurai income doesn't. Our sources talk about widespread samurai impoverishment. They're going into debt, often borrowing from the very merchants they're supposed to despise.
That must have been humiliating.
Deeply. Some samurai had to take on side jobs, things considered beneath their status, maybe becoming artisans, teachers, even, ironically, working as debt collectors for the merchants.
And you even had situations where rich merchants could essentially buy status.
Yeah, by marrying their daughters into poor samurai families. It was a way for merchant families to gain prestige, effectively buying the samurai name, while the samurai family got a much-needed infusion of cash. The social hierarchy was getting really blurred by economic reality.
So internal contradictions brewing. And meanwhile, the shogunate is doubling down on keeping the outside world out. The Sakoku policy.
Right, the closed country policy. solidified by the Edict of 1635. Japanese people were forbidden from traveling abroad. If they left, they couldn't come back. The goal was total control, prevent destabilizing foreign influences.
And Christianity was seen as a big one, wasn't it?
A major threat. It led to uprisings, most notably the Shimabara Rebellion in the late 1630s.
Yeah.
That involved disgruntled Catholic samurai and peasants.
How did the shogunate react?
Brutally. The rebellion was crushed. Estimates suggest maybe 37,000 people killed, mostly Christians. After that, Christianity was completely stamped out, driven underground. And the isolation became even stricter.
So foreign contact gets choked down to almost nothing.
Pretty much just the Chinese and the Dutch, who were famously confined to that tiny artificial island, Dejima, in Nagasaki Harbor by 1641. Limited, controlled trade, minimal cultural exchange.
Okay, so let's recap this Edo period. You've got peace, stability, but also this rigid social structure. You've got the samurai, theoretically warriors, actually bureaucrats, clinging to this Bushido ideology of self-sacrifice. And the whole thing is sealed off from the outside world.
It's like a pressure cooker, in
Yeah.
a way. The Bushido ideal is preserved almost in amber within this isolated, controlled society. The spiritual idea from the Mongol invasions is now coupled with this formalized class-based ideology.
Just waiting for something to blow the lid off.
Exactly. And that something arrived in the form of American warships.
Commodore Matthew C. Perry, 1853, sailing into Edo Bay. That must have been an unbelievable shock.
A profound shock. Perry arrives with his squadron of 4 ships, his famous black ships or gunboats. They were steam-powered, heavily armed, and they instantly exposed just how far behind Japan had fallen technologically during those 250 years of isolation.
The shogunate, the Bakufu, they had no defense against that kind of naval power, did they?
None whatsoever. They were completely unprepared. Perry basically forced them, under threat of military action, to open up ports to American trade. That led to the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. The isolation was shattered.
And this external shock landed on top of existing internal problems.
Big time. The shogunate was already weakened. There were lingering effects from major famines like the Tenpu famines. The samurai class, as we discussed, was deeply indebted and discontented. And the central government's finances were a mess. Huge deficits.
So the combination of internal weakness and external pressure just became too much.
Exactly. It all culminated in the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868. This leads to the Meiji Restoration, a period of incredibly rapid, revolutionary change.
It's almost dizzying how fast things changed then. They essentially dismantled the old feudal structure overnight.
Pretty much. The new Meiji government aggressively adopted Western models for everything: government structure, constitution, a modern legal system, compulsory education, railways, industry.
Even cultural things changed rapidly, right? Like samurai weren't wearing their top knots anymore.
Right, the Chanmage hairstyle, the sword symbols of the old samurai class. They disappeared incredibly quickly as the class system itself was abolished. It was a top-to-bottom modernization effort.
But as they're building this new modern state, they need a way to unify the people, to mobilize them, especially for a modern military. How did they do that without just importing Western ideas wholesale?
That was the critical challenge. They couldn't just rely on Western liberalism or democratic ideals alone. They reached back into their own cultural toolkit. And what did they find?
Bushido, the warrior code that kept alive during the Edo period?
Precisely. That ideology of loyalty, honor, and crucially self-sacrifice, it was ready-made. They took it out of its old feudal context, dusted it off, and re-weaponized it. But this time, the loyalty wasn't to a local daimyo. It was directed towards the emperor and the modern Japanese state.
So self-sacrifice transforms from being primarily an ethical code for a specific class into a nationalistic political tool for the entire population.
That's the key shift. And we see this start to become really explicit, almost institutionalized, during Japan's first major modern war against a Western power, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905.
Particularly during the Siege of Port Arthur, right, with General Nogi.
Yes, General Nogi Murasake. His tactics at Port Arthur were controversial even then. He relied heavily on these massive frontal assaults against heavily fortified Russian positions. These became known as Banzai charges.
Banzai meaning 10,000 years, like a cheer for the emperor, but used here for these, well, suicidal human wave attacks.
Essentially, yes. And militarily, they were often disastrous. Huge casualties, limited gains against machine guns and modern artillery. But that's not how the government spun it back home.
How did it frame it?
The government, particularly the more conservative right-leaning factions, seized on the idea of the Banzai charge. They ignored the tactical failures and instead trumpeted the spirit of self-sacrifice shown by the soldiers. This, they claimed, was the essence of Bushido, the unique strength of the Japanese spirit.
So it became propaganda, glorifying costly failures as spiritual victories.
Absolutely. It served a political purpose. It helped distract from government incompetence, the immense cost of the war, and rallied nationalist sentiment around this idea of unique Japanese virtue rooted in self-sacrifice.
They weren't just praising it, though. You mentioned they institutionalized it.
Yes, this is critical for understanding the lead up to World War II. The government didn't just celebrate this spirit. They started embedding it into official military doctrine. They revised field manuals to emphasize armed blanche tactics.
Meaning close combat, bayonets, swords.
Exactly. Prioritizing the spirit of the charge, the close quarters fight, over perhaps more modern, firepower-focused tactics. It effectively wrote fanatical self-sacrifice into the operational playbook.
So the ideal that started with divine winds saving the nation from Mongols, got preserved through centuries of peace, is now being actively engineered by the state into a core military principle.
You've got it. The groundwork for the kamikaze of World War II wasn't just cultural. It was being deliberately laid in military policy decades earlier.
Okay, so fast forward to World War II. Initially, Japan was dominant, weren't they? They didn't immediately resort to these extreme suicide tactics.
No, in the early phase of the war, they had significant advantages. Naval aviation, for example. They started the war with 10 aircraft carriers to America's 6 in the Pacific. Their pilots were highly trained and experienced.
Those were the invincible years, right? They swept through Southeast Asia, took Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines.
They did. But the tide turned, and it turned very quickly and decisively. The Battle of Midway in 1942 was the pivot point.
They lost 4 of their best carriers.
4 fleet carriers, and crucially, most of their veteran, irreplaceable pilots. After Midway, and then the grinding defeat at Guadalcanal, Japan was permanently on the defensive. They simply couldn't match the industrial power of the United States.
Resources became a huge issue, didn't they? Oil, materials.
Absolutely critical. Their oil supply was strangled by Allied submarines. Their aircraft, like the famous Zero fighter, which had been world-class early on, became increasingly obsolete compared to newer American planes like the Hellcat and the Corsair. Plus, the Americans had radar, a huge technological edge.
So the situation becomes increasingly hopeless. The industrial gap is widening. Resources are dwindling.
And this is where that ingrained re-weaponized Bushido ideology, combined with sheer desperation, pushes the military leadership to the most extreme manifestation of the kamikaze principle: purpose-built suicide weapons.
Not just pilots choosing to crash their damaged planes, but machines designed only for suicide attacks.
Exactly. Death by design across all branches of the military. The most famous, of course, is the Oka.
The cherry blossom bomb. Sounds poetic, but it was horrific.
It was basically a human-guided, rocket-propelled bomb, about 2,600 pounds of explosives. It was carried near a target by a bomber, then released. The pilot inside, often with minimal training, would guide it into an Allied ship. Top speed, maybe 600, even 750 miles per hour in a dive. Almost impossible to shoot down once launched.
And the design itself tells a story of desperation.
It really does. The sources note the design specifications stressed it needed to be extremely small. Why? For easy assembly and storage in cramped underground bunkers, because Allied bombing was relentless, and it had to be made from easily obtainable materials.
Because they were running out of everything: quality metal, skilled labor.
Precisely. It underscores the incredible shortages Japan faced by 1944-45.
And it wasn't just in the air. There were naval suicide weapons, too.
Yes, the Kaiten. The name means something like turning the heavens or shake the heavens. These were essentially manned torpedoes based on the existing Type 93 long lance torpedo, but modified with a cockpit for a single pilot and much larger warhead, about 3 times the explosive power of a standard torpedo.
Piloted directly into the hull of a ship. A one-way mission from the start.
Absolutely. The pilot was sealed inside. And on land, the Banzai charge continued, becoming even more frequent and desperate as Japanese positions were overrun across the Pacific.
You mentioned the Battle of Attu earlier.
A grim example.
Huh.
On Attu and the Aleutians, the remaining Japanese garrison, about 2,350 men, launched a final, massive Banzai charge against the American lines. It had almost no strategic impact. Only 28 Japanese soldiers survived the battle. The rest were killed. It was ideological commitment overriding any military logic.
So this huge investment in suicide tactics, this massive expenditure of human life, Was it actually effective strategically?
That's the really stark finding in the sources. Militarily, the return on investment was incredibly poor. It was terrifying, psychologically damaging for Allied sailors, no doubt. But in terms of sinking ships, not very effective.
What do the numbers say?
Out of nearly 5,000 kamikaze aircraft sorties flown in the main campaigns, the sources estimate only about 14% actually managed to get through the Allied defenses and score a hit on a ship.
Only 14% hit anything.
Right, and of the ships that were hit, only about 8.5% were actually sunk. In total, kamikaze attacks are credited with sinking around 57 Allied ships throughout the entire war. When you consider the thousands of pilots and aircraft sacrificed, the strategic impact was minimal compared to the human cost.
Which brings us to the leadership, Emperor Hirohito. His role in all this is still debated, isn't it? He was the ultimate symbol the Bushido Code was centered on.
Highly controversial. We know he consented to the decision to go to war, and later accounts, like his Chamberlain's diary, suggest he felt deep responsibility afterwards. But during the war, especially near the end,
He's reluctant to surrender.
sources indicate he was. Even when defeat was obvious, there was this push to achieve one last great victory, a Tenizin.
Tennyson, explain that concept again.
It translates literally as Emperor's Mountain, but it comes from the game of Go. It refers to a critical, decisive point in game, a make-or-break move. In the military context, Hirohito and some of his advisors were hoping for one last significant battlefield success that would give them leverage to negotiate better surrender terms, rather than accepting unconditional surrender.
Holding out for a miracle victory even when everything was collapsing.
It seems so. And the depth of this ideological commitment, this Bushido ideal, is maybe most starkly demonstrated right after the surrender finally happened.
The suicides among the high command.
Yes. Several top officers, including Admiral Onishi Takejiro, often called the father of the kamikaze, because he was instrumental in forming the first official units, and Koichiganami, the Minister of War, committed ritual suicide, seppuku.
They couldn't face the perceived dishonor of defeat.
It seems they were so deeply invested in the code, perhaps so willfully blind to the reality of the military situation, that death was preferable to surrender. It's a tragic endpoint to that long ideological arc we've been tracing, from divine protection to engineered self-destruction.
So Japan surrenders. Utter devastation. And then comes something unprecedented in Japanese history: occupation by a foreign power.
The Allied occupation, which was overwhelmingly American, led by General Douglas MacArthur as Escate Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. He was essentially the interim ruler of Japan.
And the mission was enormous. Two main goals, right? Demilitarization and democratization.
That was the mandate, a complete overhaul of Japanese society, politics, economy. MacArthur aimed to fundamentally rewire the nation, often drawing on ideas from the American New Deal.
First big step, dealing with the emperor, Hirohito.
A hugely controversial decision, but MacArthur insisted Hirohito stay on the throne. The thinking was it would ensure stability and make the occupation run smoother using the emperor's authority. But his role was completely changed.
Downgraded from a living god to just a symbol.
Exactly. He was forced to issue the Ningen Sengen, the declaration renouncing his divinity. This struck at the heart of state Shinto, the ideology that had fused emperor worship with nationalism and militarism.
And then came the new constitution, 1947, largely written by MacArthur's American staff.
Right, a revolutionary document for Japan. It shifted sovereignty explicitly from the emperor to the people. It introduced a whole raft of civil liberties, guaranteed labor rights, and a massive change gave women the right to vote.
And the most famous part, Article 9.
Ah yes, Article 9, the Peace Clause. This is where Japan formally renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes.
And it explicitly forbade maintaining land, sea, and air forces or other war potential.
It was the ultimate attempt to surgically remove militarism from the Japanese state. MacArthur and the Allies saw this as the cornerstone of ensuring Japan would never again become an aggressor, a constitutional lock against that warrior history.
Beyond the political changes, the economic restructuring was also radical.
Absolutely. Demilitarization meant dismantling the Imperial Army and Navy completely. Former military officers were purged, banned from holding political office, and then they went after the economic powerhouses that had backed the military.
The Zaibatsu, those giant family-controlled industrial conglomerates.
Exactly. Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Yasuda, these huge combines dominated the pre-war economy and had close ties to the military government. Escapee ordered them dissolved, aiming to break up monopolies and foster a more competitive, free market capitalist system.
Did it work long term? Some of those names are still around.
It's complex. The original zaibatsu were broken up, but over time, looser corporate groupings called keiretsu often formed around the same banks and companies. But the initial dissolution was still a massive shock to the old economic order.
What about land reform? That sounds like a New Deal kind of policy.
Very much so. SKP implemented a sweeping land reform program. It forced large landowners to sell excess land to the government at low prices, which then resold it to the tenant farmers who actually worked it.
So it created a huge class of independent owner farmers.
Millions of them. This was seen as crucial for democracy. It empowered the rural population and broke the power of the wealthy landlord class, who had often been strong supporters of militarism.
And labor rights were introduced too.
Yes, Japan's first Trade Union Act was passed in December 1945. Guaranteed the right to organize, to bargain collectively. Again, trying to build democratic institutions from the ground up.
The pace of social change seems incredibly fast, especially for women, getting the vote almost immediately.
It was remarkable. There were strong Japanese women activists pushing for suffrage, like Ichikawa Fusei, but MacArthur's directive really forced the issue, and the impact was visible right away.
In the first post-war election.
Yeah, women's turnout was almost 67%, much higher than many expected. For the Americans overseeing the occupation, this was seen as proof that democratic reforms could take root quickly, even in a society with very different traditions.
But the occupation wasn't all smooth sailing and positive reforms. There were darker sides, compromises.
Definitely. Keeping Hirohito on the throne meant granting him and the imperial family effective immunity from prosecution for war crimes. That remains a major point of contention and historical debate.
And censorship was pretty strict, wasn't it, despite the talk of freedom?
Oh yeah, SEP imposed extensive censorship. You couldn't criticize the United States or the Allies. You couldn't criticize the occupation policies themselves. And quite cleverly, you weren't allowed to mention the existence of censorship at all.
How did that work in practice if something was cut from a newspaper?
They couldn't just leave a blank space or indicate text was removed. The entire article had to be rewritten to hide the fact that anything had been censored. It created this facade of a free press while maintaining tight control over information.
Another really difficult aspect was the issue of sexual violence by occupation troops.
A very grim chapter. With over 300,000 Allied troops stationed in a defeated, impoverished country, Japanese authorities were terrified of widespread rape targeting ordinary women.
So they set up brothels, officially.
Yes, they established something called the Recreation and Amusement Association, the RAA. It was essentially a large-scale system of brothels organized specifically for the occupation soldiers. The sources suggest Japanese officials saw this as a horrific necessity, a kind of breakwater to protect the civilian female population.
Did it work in that awful sense?
The sources indicate that while the RAA was operating, the rate of rapes reported among the general population was relatively low. But the RAA itself was exploitative and riddled with problems, particularly venereal disease.
Which led MacArthur to shut it down.
Yes. In early 1946, largely due to the high rates of STDs among Allied troops. But after the RAA was closed, the reported incidence of rape against Japanese women increased significantly. One estimate, though it's debated, suggests it jumped dramatically, maybe to over 300 incidents a day. It shows the incredibly complex, often tragic, unintended consequences of the occupation.
Okay, so the occupation ends in 1952. Japan regains its sovereignty, albeit with this American written constitution and Article 9 still in place. What happens next is often called the economic miracle.
It really was miraculous. Japan's recovery and subsequent growth were phenomenal. It got an early boost from the Korean War. Japan became a crucial supply base for the UN forces, which pumped huge amounts of money into the economy.
And then it just took off.
It soared. Through the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, rapid industrialization, massive export growth. Japan became the world's second largest economy, measured by GNP. Standard of living rose dramatically. It became this affluent, technologically advanced society.
And Article 9 arguably played a role there too, right? By limiting defense spending.
That's a common argument, yeah. With the U.S. security guarantee, Japan could dedicate a much larger share of its national resources to economic development rather than military budgets.
But that success created its own problems, particularly with trade partners.
Oh, absolutely. By the 1970s, Japan was exporting so much high-quality, competitive stuff cars, electronics, that it started causing major trade friction, especially with the U.S. and Europe. They were running these huge trade surpluses that Western countries found, as the sources say, intolerably large.
Leading to trade disputes calls for protectionism, issues that still linger.
They do. But then, After those decades of incredible growth, Japan hit a wall. The 1990s.
The lost decade.
Right. The speculative asset bubble stocks, real estate burst spectacularly around 1990-91. The stock market crashed, property values plummeted, and the economy entered this long period of stagnation or very slow growth that lasted through the 90s and arguably beyond.
And that had social consequences too, like the end of lifetime employment.
Yet, that system, which had been a hallmark of the post-war corporate culture companies offering job security for life in exchange for loyalty, it largely broke down during the lost decade as companies were forced to restructure and cut costs.
And now, looking at Japan today, there's another huge challenge looming: demographics.
It's arguably the biggest long-term challenge. Japan has one of the world's oldest populations and one of the lowest birth rates. This is putting immense strain on the social security system, healthcare, the labor force. It affects everything.
So we've seen these huge swings: feudalism, isolation, rapid modernization, militarism, devastating war, occupation, economic miracle, stagnation, demographic crisis. But through all that, do the sources suggest some underlying things have remained constant? Cultural continuity.
They really emphasize this point. Despite all the surface upheaval, certain deep structures and cultural characteristics seem remarkably persistent. Well, one source points out that the post-war power structure, this kind of trinity of the government bureaucracy, the dominant political party, usually the LDP, and big business, it actually mirrors the pre-war coalition in some ways, just without the military element being overt.
And the structure is supported by enduring cultural traits.
Yes. Things like a strong sense of national unity, high value placed on education, an awareness of communal solidarity, and a collective drive for achievement. These qualities, the sources argue, help explain why Japan can sometimes change very rapidly, like the economic miracle, but also resist fundamental shifts in other areas.
Like social reforms that were maybe attempted earlier but didn't stick.
Right. The cultural bedrock provides stability, facilitates top-down economic drives, but can make grassroots or fundamental political realignments more difficult.
Which brings us back, inevitably, to Article 9 and the military. All this cultural continuity combined with modern geopolitical threats. Something had to give, didn't it?
It seems so. The post-Cold War world, and especially recent events, have put immense pressure on Japan's post-war security posture.
You mean concerns about China, North Korea, Russia?
Exactly. The sources specifically point to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine as a wake-up call, but even more directly, Chinese military actions, like missile tests landing near Japan's exclusive economic zone after Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
So Japan made a major policy shift.
A huge one. In December 2022, the government announced a new national security strategy. For the first time, it explicitly included acquiring counterstrike capabilities.
Meaning the ability to hit missile launch sites or bases in enemy territory. That sounds like a big departure from a purely defensive posture.
It is a fundamental shift. And alongside that, they announced plans to dramatically increase defense spending, aiming to nearly double it as a percentage of GDP by 2027, potentially reaching NATO levels.
So despite Article 9, regional realities are forcing Japan to rearm, essentially.
It certainly looks that way. It raises profound questions about whether a constitutional clause, even one imposed after total defeat, can permanently override perceived national security needs and perhaps these deeper currents of cultural identity and historical experience.
Is that 900-year history we traced just dormant, not erased? Hashtag tag outro.
Well, we started this deep dive with that single image of the Kamikaze pilot from World War II.
Yeah, that stark image of desperate fanaticism.
And what we've hopefully shown by tracing this back through the centuries is that it wasn't just a sudden madness of war. It was really the culmination, the endpoint of this incredibly long ideological and political journey.
A journey that starts way back in the 13th century with those Mongol invasions and the belief in the Kamikaze, the divine wind.
A belief that gets preserved, almost incubated during the centuries of Edo isolation, where the Bushido code of the samurai becomes formalized, even as they become bureaucrats.
And then that code gets deliberately picked up, re-engineered, and weaponized by the modernizing Meiji state, turned into a tool of nationalism, institutionalizing self-sacrifice for the emperor and the nation.
Leading eventually to the Banzai charges, the Oka, the Kaiten, the ultimate desperate expressions of that ideology in World War II.
Then comes the shock of defeat. The American occupation trying to completely reset everything with a new constitution, democratization, and Article 9 specifically designed to end militarism forever.
But what we also see is this remarkable resilience of Japanese society, that capacity for rapid change, the economic miracle, built on top of what seems to be a very stable, continuous cultural foundation.
Which leads us to today, where, despite Article 9, Japan is significantly increasing its defense capabilities in response to real-world threats in its neighborhood.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Can an identity shaped over 900 years, one that includes deep strands of heroic self-sacrifice, divine destiny, and national unity in the face of external threats, can that be permanently altered or suppressed by a single article in a constitution, even one born from total defeat?
Or, facing new pressures, is Japan now in the process of writing the next chapter in that long, complex history of its relationship with military power and national identity? Is the evolution already happening?
Something to think about.
Definitely something profound to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.